Welcome, friends, to Strange Connections number 1. We're going to have a series of presentations of strange connections, and we're starting off. We wanted to start off with a bang, so we're starting off with the connection between Atlantis Island and the plateau at Troy. This is our first strange connection. Over 5,000 books written about the location of Atlantis, many theories. And so we're going to start off with some information about speculation versus investigation and what's the difference between a fact and conjecture. So if you look in Webster's dictionary, it says that speculation, you look up speculation and it says, it's defined speculation as to conjecture. It defines conjecture as an inferring, theorizing, or predicting from incomplete or uncertain evidence. Guesswork, guess. Okay, we look up the definition of investigate, and it says to search into so as to learn the facts, inquire into systematically. Okay, what is conjecture? Conjecture is a theory based on evidence with only a slight degree of credibility. It is an idea of fact or potential cause or occurrence as suggested by another fact, which is too feeble to prove the idea. A conjecture is even less substantial than a hypothesis, which is generally based on well-accepted facts. We need to be careful not to speculate about something we see in nature and conclude that that was Atlantis' location. There have been over 5,000 theories using this method. What are Atlantis facts? To avoid speculation and conjecture, we must decide what we accept as a fact before looking at our evidence. Since Atlantis no longer exists and Plato and other historians have died, will we accept their writings as a fact or speculation? Since Plato alone wrote about Atlantis in his dialogues of Timaeus and Critias, we must accept his record as being as close to facts as we're going to get. If the writings of other ancient historians are consistent with Plato's, then we may consider their representations as fact. We will consider these writings on a case-by-case basis. I think that this is very significant to understand the difference between conjecture and investigation, between facts and theory, guesswork. And like I said, there's been like 5,000 theories about the location of Atlantis. Once you see the evidence that we've got now, you'll understand the difference, a big difference. Okay, so let's take a look at the evidence. Currently, this island is known by 4 different names. Its civilization spoke an untranslated language called Tyrrhenian and kept no records. It was destroyed in one day by invasion, earthquakes, and floods. patriarch Poseidon named it the Atlantic Island. That's with an I-C, Atlantic Island. The Greeks called it Chrysi Island. And Chrysi in Greek means gold. Ezekiel called it Tyrus Island. And in about 365 BC, Plato heard the story from Socrates, and he wrote the story calling it Atlantis Island. So he was working off what Poseidon had named it, Atlantic Island, and he changed the spelling to Atlantis Island. And I'm speculating that he changed the C to an S because nouns in Greek ending in S are considered masculine. So I think that's why he changed the spelling. Its location has been one of the world's most famous mysteries. So let's solve the mystery. Fact number 1. Plato writes in his dialogues of Timaeus and Critias, the men of Atlantis have subjected the parts of Libya within the columns of Heracles as far as Egypt, and of Europe as far as Tyrrhenia. Okay, so looking at a map of the Mediterranean, we can see that Libya, Egypt, and Tyrrhenia, they're all in the Mediterranean Sea region. Okay, we're looking at the map of the Mediterranean. Plato says that Atlantis was located in this area between Libya, Egypt, and Tyrrhenia in Europe, is up here on the west coast of Italy. And it's called, that area is called, right now, it's the Tyrrhenian Sea. Okay, so anyhow, this is a map of the Mediterranean, and we know, fact number 1, Atlantis was in this area someplace. Okay, so now you see that the Mediterranean region is where Atlantis was located, and you can see why. From the words right out of Plato's mouth. He said Libya, Egypt, and Tyrrhenia. These are locations within the Mediterranean region. So, because Plato said this, we're accepting this as a fact, not a speculation. This is fact number 1. All right, he continues, there was an island situated in front of the straits. Webster's defines straits as a narrow waterway connecting two large bodies of water. In the Mediterranean, there are 2 locations that qualify as straits. The Atlantic Ocean connects to the Mediterranean Sea via the Gibraltar Straits. The Black Sea, or Marmara Sea, connects to the Aegean Sea via the Dardanelle Straits. These are the only 2 straits connecting large bodies of water in the Mediterranean in 365 BC, when Plato wrote this. So the possible locations for Atlantis is now down to 2 places. It's one of 2 places. That's fact number 2. And these are using the words of Plato coming right out of his mouth. So this is, in my opinion, this is not speculation. These are facts. Okay, fact number 3. For this sea, which is within the Straits of Heracles, is only a harbor, having a narrow entrance, but that other is a real sea. One of the 2 straits contained a harbor with a narrow entrance. The Gibraltar Straits has no record of a harbor within the straits. However, Homer's Iliad in 800 BC records that there was a harbor at Troy within the Dardanelle Straits. Okay, in Iliad, chapter 1, verse or line 487, he says, "Help the Trojans' cause, trap them round the bay." Okay, in the Iliad, 14th chapter, line 42, he says, "The bay's gaping mouth enclosed by the jaws of the 2 jutting headlands." Okay, in Iliad 13, chapter 13, line 24, he says regarding Poseidon, this is, the Iliad is kind of a poetic thing that he wrote. And so he's talking about Poseidon sitting on top of Samos Island looking down at the Trojan War, and he says, 3 great strides he, Poseidon, took. On the 4th he reached his goal, Aegae Port, where his famous halls are built. So a port is a harbor. It's a place that ships are moored up, and they are anchored. We call it anchored these days. And they wait. Okay, fact number 4. We have eliminated all possible locations except here at the mouth of the Dardanelle Straits in the Aegean Sea. This was the location of Plato's Atlantis Island. The Aegean Sea is the real sea referred to here by Plato. Okay, Homer calls Poseidon's island Chryse Island. And this is evidence of one of the terms that was used to identify the island. Okay, in the Iliad, in the 1st chapter, line 21, he says, "Hear me," he cried, "O God of the silver bow, that protectest Chryse and holy Scylla, and rulest Tenedos with thy might. Hear me, O thy smithy." In the Iliad, 1st chapter, lines 462 to 64, "One girl, Chrysis, the fiery-eyed Achaeans ferry out in a fast trim ship to Chryse Island, laden with presents for the god." Okay, in the Iliad, 1st chapter, line 117, he says, "And carry a sacred 100 bulls to Chryse town." So Chryse was the name of the island used by the Greeks. Okay, in the Iliad, chapter 13, line 20 to 41, there is a vast cave down in the dark sounding depths, mid-sea, between Tenedos and Imbros rugged cliffs. And if you look at the map, Tenedos and Imbros, right in the middle between those two, is where Atlantis was located. Now, we have some updated evidence from Dr. John C. Kraft, PhD, who is an archaeologist. And Dr. Kraft took a team of 4 archaeologists, and he went to, well, let me read what it says. John C. Kraft, PhD, has been studying the ancient coastlines of the eastern Mediterranean Sea for more than 2 decades and has concluded that there was a great bay adjacent to Troy. During the Trojan War, circa 1250 BC, Dr. Kraft writes in his February 2003 issue of journal Geology, which is published by the Geological Society of America, that the area's sedimentology and geomorphology do indeed complement the features described in Homer's Iliad. The reality of Homer's description of place, event, and topography correlated with geologic investigation helps show that the Iliad is not just a legend, but a regularly consistent with paleogeographic reconstruction, concluded the research team. The members of the team included George Rapp of the University of Minnesota, İlhan Kayan of Edge University in Izmir, Turkey, and classical scholar John V. Luce of Trinity College in Dublin, Ireland. Using borings to determine the geomorphic environment, the researchers were able to develop maps of the changing coastline and found that the landscape at the time of the Homeric account of the Trojan War does indeed match descriptions in the Iliad and in Strabo's later geography. So this is a picture by Dr. Kraft of the Bay of Troy. Okay, we're looking now at the Bay of Troy illustration by Dr. John C. Kraft. This is the bay. Troy was located on the bay, back in this area. This is the Dardanelle Straits. This is the Aegean Sea. The island of Atlantis was right out here. So the surface was imploded by earthquakes, and washed into this bay. And Plato says that it was mud and subsidence that filled up the area so you could not sail that way anymore. So this now is a plateau. It's a flat area. It was mud, so it had to have dried and it had to be flat. And underneath of it, there's a very good chance that there could be some gold statuary that was washed off the island that's now underneath the plateau at Troy. So I wish someone would take some ground penetrating radar and take a look at that area. And we also have an illustration by G. Kenneth Sams of the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill of the Bay of Troy. He also has a similar drawing illustration to Dr. Kraft of that bay. In addition to Homer and Plato, we have this quote from 2nd century Greek traveler Pausanias. Pausanias says, "No long sail from Lemnos was once an island, Chryse, where it is said Philocrates met with his accident from the water snake. But the waves utterly overwhelmed it, and Chryse sank and disappeared in the depths. So temporary and utterly weak are the fortunes of men." All right, fact number 5. Plato goes on to describe army combat, but afterwards there occurred violent earthquakes and floods, and in a single day and night of misfortune, all your warlike men in a body sank into the earth. And the island of Atlantis in like manner disappeared in the depths of the sea. For which reason the sea in those parts is impassable and impenetrable, because there is a shoal of mud in the way. And this was caused by the subsidence of the island. The Bay of Troy was filled in with the surface of Atlantis Island. And this is a fact right here that has been overlooked by all of the theories that I've ever heard about the location of Atlantis. They never realize that what they're talking about. I mean, the subsidence, the tsunami that came behind the earthquake, washed the surface off of the island. Now, what Poseidon had dug canals all over the surface of his island so that ships could sail onto the island and exchange and trade and barter goods. All of these ships were coming into Atlantis, sailing onto the island down these canals and trading. And because he had all of these canals dug into the surface of his island, he weakened the surface of the island. I mean, they were everywhere. And so what happened is the earthquake shook the island, imploded the surface, and then the tsunamis, which usually follow earthquakes, washed the top right off of the island and into the Bay of Troy. Okay? That's what happened. That is consistent. I guess you could say that is a speculation on my part that happened, but it's consistent with the bay at Troy not being there anymore. Well, how did it disappear? This is how it disappeared. Now here is a map of the area of Atlantis. Okay, this is a current satellite photo that I got of the area that Atlantis was located in. It was located in this area right here. This is the Dardanelle Straits. Troy is way back here, off of the water. It used to be on the water. This whole area right here was filled in by the subsidence of the surface of the island of Atlantis, washed into the bay and filled it up. And so this now is a flat area, a plateau, the plateau at Troy. Okay, so this is Tenedos Island. We're going to be going into this. This is the island of Lemnos. This is a very special island, and we're going to be going into that in Strange Connection number 2. the treasury. The preceding statement by Plato gives us two very important pieces of information. The Bay of Troy was filled in by the shoal of mud or subsidence of the island, making it no longer navigable. That's what he said. These are the words right out of his mouth. And what might we find mixed in with the subsidence under the plain at Troy? Plato tells us, Poseidon's own temple covered with silver and the pinnacles with gold. In the temple they placed statues of gold. There was the god Poseidon himself standing in a chariot of such a size that he touched the roof of the building with his head. Around the outside of the temple were placed statues of gold of all the descendants of Poseidon, his 10 king sons and their wives. The random probability of this misfortune to happen to this island on that day works out to 1 chance in 300 trillion. Far less likely than people having identical fingerprints. 2 people having identical fingerprints. This misfortune is Atlantis fingerprint. So what Plato is saying is that in one day there was an army invasion of the island. There were earthquakes and there were floods. And the combination of those 3 things totally destroyed the island, ripped the top off the island so that there was nothing. There was no people, there were no buildings, there was no dirt, nothing left. So the random probability of that happening on one day to that island came out to, and we'll kind of talk about a little bit about the probabilities there, but came out to 1 chance in 300 trillion. I mean, that is very, very, very. I mean, that's longer odds than hitting the lottery, you know, and there's not much chance of that, right? Okay, fact number 6: the historical fingerprint of Atlantis. Plato describes the final day of an island's existence as being conquered by an invading army, imploded by violent earthquakes, pummeled by massive tsunamis, and swallowed up by the sea. By quantifying the random probability of this series of events on one day, it becomes obvious as DNA evidence that this disaster could never happen twice. Okay, so calculating a desired probability. This is an example. If a coin is flipped 3 times, what is the random probability of it coming up heads 3 times? Right, the method is to determine each possible outcome, then multiply them. Each possible outcome in this example is 1 of 2, or 1 divided by 2. A heads or tails. Multiplying them works out like this. 1 over 2 times 1 over 2 times 1 over 2 equals 1 over 8. Or a random probability that 3 heads will appear in 8 attempts at this example. So you do this 8 times, and 1 time it's going to come out heads, heads, heads, all heads. Okay, so now let's calculate the random probability of these 3 events occurring to any one island on the same day. We can be conservative with estimating possible outcomes and still realize dramatic probabilities. The possible days available for any of these events would be 5000 BC minus 571 BC, which is what we estimate that this disaster happened, equals 4,429 years times 365 days a year equals 1,616,585 possible days for each event to occur. So any one of those days we could have had earthquakes. Any one of those days we could have had an invasion by an army. Any one of those days we could have had floods. Okay, so for all 3 of those things to happen on the same day, this is what makes it so unique. We will estimate that 1 in 20 of the Earth's islands were destroyed by earthquakes during that time period, and 1 in 20 islands were destroyed by tsunamis. It's probably more like 1 in 1,000 or 1 in 150, but the bigger the denominator at the bottom of the fraction, the higher the odds are going to be. So we're keeping the numbers low, conservative. So we estimate 1 in 5 islands were conquered by invading armies. The random probability of these 3 events on the same day happening to any one island works out as follows. And then we multiply it out, and it comes out to 1 chance in 300 trillion. We're going to have a PDF copy of this whole presentation so you can study this projections if you like. It'd probably be better. So the random probability is almost impossible to ever happen once, but Plato writes that it did happen. This final day is unique to Atlantis Island, its fingerprint. Any historian that describes this series of events on one day as happening to any island is writing about Plato's Atlantis Island. Can we agree on that? I mean, if what happened to it could only happen one time in 300 trillion attempts, if it did happen to an island, it's not going to happen twice. It should never have even happened once, but it did. Okay, so what we're saying is that this is the fingerprint of Atlantis, and any other historian that says that these 3 things happened to this island, and using a different name for the island, we know that he's talking about the same island. It's Atlantis, okay? The fingerprint appears. Plato connects with Ezekiel. This same series of events is described as happening to an island called Tyrus by Ezekiel around 571 BC. Chapters 26 and 27 of the Old Testament. As in a court of law, it is beyond a reasonable doubt that Plato and Ezekiel are describing the same island with the same historical fingerprint. Then we have the northern Anatolian earthquake fault. We have a little map of that here. It runs right through where Atlantis Island was. And this is fact number 7. Northern Anatolian earthquake fault. Okay, so what we're looking at here is the northern Anatolian earthquake fault, which is right here. So those tectonic plates are pushing and squeezing Turkey in this direction of the arrows. Atlantis was located right out here. See that this is the Dardanelle Straits, and Atlantis was located right out in this area. And in Troy used to be right over in that area. So this is the tectonic activity that's gone on for years, and that's what happened to Atlantis Island was the earthquake. It just imploded the top of the island because Poseidon had dug all those canals in the surface so he could get more business and make more money. And he weakened the surface of his island. When the earthquake hit, it just imploded, and it just fell apart, and the tsunamis just washed it right off the top and filled up the Bay of Troy. So Ezekiel chapter 26, he talks to us about Tyrus, and he says that it was destroyed by Nebuchadnezzar's army. Ezekiel 26, 1 and 29, 18 through 19. Earthquakes and floods. Nebuchadnezzar died about 560 BC. So before he died, his army attacked this island, and the island was hit with the earthquakes and the floods and was destroyed. And so this happened about 571 BC. Okay, after Tyrus was destroyed, approximately 571 BC. Briefly, Tyrus was an island, that's Ezekiel 27:4, located at the entry of the sea, Ezekiel 27:3, which art a merchant of the people for many isles. Its mariners were of Zidon and Arvad, an island near Lebanon. The ancients of Jebel, that's Byblos, Lebanon, were its wise men. So these were Phoenicians, these men. So this tells us that these Phoenicians migrated from Lebanon north up to this location near Troy. This tells us the men of Tyrus were descendants of Phoenicians of Lebanon. So we have now a comparison between Tyrus and Atlantis. Okay, this is really important. We want to show the comparison between Atlantis and Tyrus and show that it's the same place. So Plato wrote all of this information about Atlantis, and Ezekiel wrote all of this about Tyrus. Okay, so with Atlantis, Plato wrote, "But afterwards, after the invasion, there occurred violent earthquakes and floods, and in a single day and night of misfortune, all your warlike men in a body sank into the earth, and Atlantis disappeared in the depths of the sea." Ezekiel writes, He shall slay thy people by the sword. Shall not the isles shake at the sound of thy fall, when the wounded cry, when the slaughter is made in the midst of thee, and great waters cover thee? This is Ezekiel chapter 26, verses 11, 15, and 19. Okay, number 2, it says, in this island of Atlantis, Ezekiel says, thy borders are in the midst of the seas. So a border would be the extremity of the location of the property, and if it's in the midst of the seas, it means it's surrounded by seas. So it's an island. Number 3, Atlantis was situated in front of the straits. And Ezekiel says, thou art situate at the entry of the sea. Okay, which would have been the entry of the sea would have been the Marmara Sea, the entry of the Marmara Sea into the Aegean Sea. Number 4 says, Plato says, rulers of diverse islands in the open sea. Ezekiel says, many isles were the merchandise of thy hand. So they owned a lot of they called them isles. In the Aegean Sea, there were like 3,000 little islands, tons of islands in the Aegean Sea. So these Tyrrhenians apparently owned that area. Okay, number 5, Plato says, the canal and the largest of the harbors were full of vessels and merchants from all parts, who kept up a multitudinous sound of human voices and din and clatter of all sorts night and day. So it sounds like a very, very busy business going on around the clock, 24/7. Okay, Ezekiel says, all the ships of the sea were in thee to occupy thy merchandise. And that's Ezekiel 27, 12 through 24. Yeah, that's where they list all the different merchants and what they were trading. So Ezekiel actually gives us the names and the merchandise that they brought. Item number 6. They had such an amount of wealth as was never before possessed by kings and potentates. And Ezekiel says, thou hast gotten thee riches, and hast gotten gold and silver into thy treasures. Thine heart is lifted up because of thy riches. Ezekiel, that's Ezekiel 28, 4 and 5. Okay, item number 7. Plato says, they were full of avarice, which is greed, and unrighteous power. Ezekiel says, by the multitude of thy merchandise they have filled the midst of thee with violence. And that's Ezekiel 28, 16. Okay, Plato says on number 8, Atlantis had subjected the parts of Libya. And Ezekiel says, they of Put, which Put, P-H-U-T, that is Libya,
were in thine army. That's Ezekiel 27:10. Okay, number 9. The island of Atlantis disappeared into the depths of the sea. And Plato says Ezekiel says at number 9, I shall bring up the deep upon thee, and great waters shall cover thee. That's Ezekiel 26:19. And then the last item, number 10, Plato says, the sea in those parts is impassable and impenetrable, because there is a shoal of mud in the way, and this was caused by the subsidence of the island. Again, that is the Bay of Troy that was filled in by the surface of the island just being washed away by the tsunami. Okay, number 10, Ezekiel says, I will also scrape her dust from her and make her like the top of a rock. That's Ezekiel 26:4. So they say the same thing in different ways to describe the island of Atlantis and the island of Tyrus. So it's the same place. Okay, I just wanted to cover that a little bit. It's important. Okay, fact number 8. From Greek history, we are provided the names and locations of the sons of Poseidon. They were all living within the Mediterranean, and most of them were centered in the Aegean region. Their locations and names are as follows. So we have a map of the Aegean Sea, and all the little red numbers represent the locations of all the sons of Poseidon. They were living all around the Aegean Sea. Okay, so what we're looking at here is the sons of Poseidon. We have a map of Greece, Turkey, call it Asia Minor. All of the sons' locations are in red. The red letters are the sons of Poseidon. Poseidon himself was, here's the Dardanelle Straits, so he was located over here. His island of Atlantis was close to Troy. And as you can see from this map, the Bay of Troy has already been filled in on this map. You see these peninsulas that stick out here into the water? This is the kind of thing that Poseidon was working on. He was cutting these things off. He had his guys out there just cutting them off and creating islands. He was making islands so that they would be more secure. Any of the armies that were wanting to attack them would have to do it over water because they were living on an island. And these guys were Phoenicians. They were expert sailors, expert on the seas. Okay, now we also have Ezekiel provides for us all of the trading partners for Tyrus. All of the people that were coming to trade goods on their island, we have a list of them. Here's the map. It shows they were coming from Saudi Arabia, they were coming from Iraq, from Syria, from Turkey, Egypt. They were coming from Greece and Libya, and I believe even which isn't on the map. Some of the Portugal, Spain, some of those countries, and even Yemen. I think that there was a queen that brought jewelry from Yemen to trade. Okay, so what we're looking at here is Ezekiel gives us a list of the trading partners for Atlantis, and all of these numbers are the locations of people that were coming to Atlantis to buy, to trade, to barter their goods. They were coming from Turkey, Egypt, Libya, Saudi Arabia. They were even coming on horseback from Saudi Arabia, Yemen. I believe there was a queen that came up from Yemen bringing gemstones to trade. Saudi Arabia, Iraq, and then Turkey. So they were coming from all over this area, and even from Spain. They were coming from Spain, so that the whole Mediterranean, all the countries in the Mediterranean were coming to Atlantis and meeting with the countries that were around over here on the freshwater countries around the Black Sea and the Sea of Marmara.
Okay, so we've seen we've seen what Plato has to say, what Ezekiel has to say. We've seen some historians, Pausanias. We've seen Greek history about the sons of Poseidon. I mean, we've got all kinds of witnesses. We've got these ancient historians, which Plato was. We've got what they have to say about this, and so this is not really speculation. I think we have to accept that these are facts, what these men had to say about the location of Atlantis Island and the people that occupied it. All right, but let's take a look at the conclusion. Atlantis is important because it was the center of commerce on planet Earth in 1000 BC. See, the USA was 2,500 years away. So I think, 1776, we had our independence, and anyhow, it's 2,500 years before the United States became independent. Shipping was the primary method for delivery of large quantities of merchandise during Atlantis time. It was located at the intersection of salt water in the Aegean Sea and fresh water at the Black Sea and the Mare Sea, at the mouth of the Dardanelle Straits. If you look at the map, it's just unbelievable, the location, because fresh water was coming down from the Black Sea and the Sea of Marmara. That's all fresh water. That's water that was melted off the top of all the mountains in Turkey. It was melting, it was coming down, it was filled up the Black Sea and the Sea of Marmara, and then it was flowing out into the Aegean Sea, the saltwater sea. So the thing was it was a fantastic location because they could trade saltwater habitat, all the fish that grew in the saltwater, with the fish that grew in the freshwater. They could. It was just the perfect location. And if you look at the map, it's like right between the two. It was in the center, pretty much in the center, so that all of these people, instead of trying to drive or ride their boat from country to country to trade, they could just all go to Atlantis and trade. It was the very first mall on Earth was Atlantis Island. Okay, many countries like Saudi Arabia, Persia, and Iraq traded via horseback to get to the trading fairs of Atlantis. They were called fairs by Ezekiel. So that they're kind of like festivals. Like we look at a festival now, where you have all kinds of merchandise to look at and buy, and they're exciting. They're fun. That's the way it was with Atlantis. It was the first shopping mall on Earth. The Phoenicians of Atlantis were the dominant force at that time. Expert seamen, skillful miners and builders, and were the water project engineers for Rome. Patriarch Poseidon was called an island builder, as he severed many peninsulas from the mainland, leaving the extreme tips as an island, like the Isle of Capri in Italy. These Phoenicians, these guys were so strong in the sea that they felt safer being on an island than they were on the mainland, because they couldn't be attacked except by sea. If somebody was going to attack them, they had to be in a boat and come over and get on their island, and they felt very secure about that. So Poseidon was actually making islands, I think, for that reason. In fact, I read about one guy that lived on, he had his house built in the middle of a lake. He had some sort of a mound area where it was built up, and he could build a foundation and put his house right in the middle of the lake. So his whole house was surrounded by water. Okay, so Plato and Ezekiel write that they were greedy and violent. The Hittites and Mycenaeans are two of the civilizations destroyed by a loose-knit association of mercenaries called the Sea People. There is evidence that they were part of this association. The Trojan War. Okay, the Phoenicians of Atlantis were the dominant force at that time.
expert seamen, skillful miners and builders, and were water project engineers for Rome. Patriarch Poseidon was called an island builder, as he had severed many peninsulas from the mainland, leaving the extreme tips as an island, like the Isle of Capri. They felt very comfortable on the water, and they felt like if they lived on an island, that anyone that would want to attack them would have to do it from a boat. And so they were very skilled in combat on the water, and for that reason they like to live on islands. Plato and Ezekiel write that they were greedy and violent. The Hittites and Mycenaeans are two of the civilizations destroyed by a loose-knit association of mercenaries called the Sea People. These people are a mystery even to today. You try to do research on it, and nobody really knows who they were. I mean, in my studies, I kind of have an idea. There's an evidence that they were part of this association. The Trojan War, 1190 BC to 1180 BC, between the Greeks and the Turkish forces, had a lot to do with control of the Dardanelle Straits. I mean, those ships coming down the Dardanelle Straits, they had to go right by Troy, the Trojan army, and Atlantis. They were right there. Ezekiel said that they were harassing all that haunted them or visited them. Everybody that came by had a hard time with them. Okay, so the Ark of the Covenant disappeared from Jerusalem in 925 BC. We will explore the evidence for their role in this theft in Strange Connection number 3. There's quite a bit of evidence about that. Strange Connection number 2 is between the underground labyrinth described by historian Pliny and Zechariah's stronghold built by Tyrus. Zechariah writes, "And Tyrus did build herself a stronghold, and heaped up silver as the dust, and fine gold as the mire of the streets." Stay tuned. Exciting, true details ahead. All of this information is from a book. It's called Atlantis, the Renamed Island. And it's available. It's available on Amazon.com. And on the back of the book is some information. Here's a picture of an underwater scene from the labyrinth that we're going to be talking about in Strange Connection number 2. It's very interesting. I mean, Plato said that Atlantis was richer than any country that ever existed or likely will exist. These guys they were wiping out civilizations even and taking their stuff. So, I mean, they had so much gold and silver and gemstones. And when I get into the Ark of the Covenant, there's some stuff in there too about other treasures that they were more proud of these other treasures than they were their gold and silver. If you can believe that. Anyhow, we'll get into that. That's pretty exciting stuff. Okay, so that pretty much wraps up Strange Connection number 1. We've used as facts. We've used the words of Plato, Ezekiel, Zechariah, Pausanias, the historical data that we found, and tried to avoid speculating. I mean, sometimes you have to, like the fact that, well, he said that the subsidence had filled, the subsidence had made it so you couldn't sail that way anymore, and that was he was referring to the Bay of Troy. So, personally, I wish that somebody would take some ground-penetrating radar over the plateau at Troy and see what's under it. I think that you would find that there's some gold statuary underneath that the plateau at Troy. Okay, so that's it. We'll wrap it up for today, and I'm looking forward to doing the next one, Strange Connection number 2. Okay, thank you for tuning in today for Strange Connection number 1. Please subscribe to our channel, Strange Connections. Be sure to click on the bell so you can get notified when a new presentation has been put online. The description box will have links for this presentation, the PDF copy of the presentation, for the book. The book, I believe it's under $20. It's got almost 400 pages. I mean, there's so much information in here. There's about, I don't know, over 100 pictures, photos. I have satellite photos, lots of satellite photos of the location of Atlantis and also their treasury. In fact, I think I have a ton of pictures of their treasury, and that picture on the back is it's an underwater sculptor picture of the treasury. But in any event, look in the box. All of the links are going to be there for my social media locations. Everything is going to be there in the box. So just check it out and come back and listen. I mean, this is going to be really exciting. Strange Connection number 2, again, is going to be about the treasury that they built, where they were hiding all their gold and silver. I mean, it's unbelievable. And we're going to have tons of photographs for you to look at. So anyhow, we'll see you again next time. Bye-bye.